You clearly weren't aware that you made me miserable.
It's hard to say that I'd rather stay awake when I'm asleep, 'cause everything is never as it seems.
So since I'm not your everything, how about I'll be nothing, nothing at all to you. Baby, I won't shed a tear for you.
Said I'd give it all up if I could have just one day, just one day. And now we got it.
I call this the most satisfying chord because it has this ethereal, awesome, larger-than-life quality to it, and also because I want you to click on the video. But what's a major 2 chord? How does it work, and how can you implement it into your own songwriting? These are numbered by Roman numerals 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and the 2 remaining numbers. You build chords from these scale degrees by stacking 2/3, and then you have a triad, which is a chord or a common chord. From these degrees you get 3 different types of chords: major, minor, and diminished. And you can pick and choose from each of these scale degrees. These are the most popular ones, these are the least popular ones, but know that they are all used a lot in music. Where it becomes interesting is when we start to play with chords from outside the scale, and there are several different options for this. When a chord's a dominant, it means it leads back to another chord a fifth below, or in other words, it's unresolved when played without any chord following it. In a scale, this is done going from the 5 to the 1. However, you can also play a dominant chord to approach a different chord from the scale other than the 1. This means it has to be a fifth above the approach chord. And that means you have to use notes that are not diatonic in the key. That being said, secondary dominants are still very commonly used. We also have tritone substitutions, which is sort of like a secondary dominant where you approach a chord by playing the major chord a half note above the target chord, meaning you approach the chord chromatically, which sounds nice. You can Google why it's called a tritone sub, because it's actually quite boring. The thing that isn't boring is chromatic mediants. Chromatic mediants ditches the emphasis of chord movements in fifths, but does so in thirds instead. This means you can approach any chord with a chord either major or minor, a minor or major third below or above. This is pretty much the building blocks for film scoring, and goes as far as the chord movements being named after popular film characters. And lastly, there's
Modal Interchange,
which is what is happening with the major 2. Okay, so remember how I talked about the 7 notes on a scale? You can shift all the chords 1 scale degree, so the 2 is now the 1. This results in a completely new scale with a vastly different sound, surprisingly enough. The minor scale, which some of you might have heard of, is, for example, the major scale shifted 6 places. These are called modes in modal harmony, and in some European countries they're referred to as the church modes. Swapping different chords from different modes is what's called
Modal Interchange.
For example, let's say we're in C major and we have a 2 chord in our chord progression. That chord would have to be in minor, but with modal interchange we can swap it for any 2 chord of the different modes. Let's just use one completely at random. Lydian, that's great. We can now swap the minor 2 chord for a major 2 chord instead, and that's modal interchange. Alright, but what's the major 2 chord then? In short, it's when the 2 chord is played in major instead of minor, which is what is diatonic in the scale. And this results in the chord sounding surprising and exciting because it's something new to our ears. However, playing the 2nd degree in major can be used in many different contexts. The most common way to use it is as a secondary dominant. The major 2 can act as a secondary dominant where it leads to the 6th degree. It's seen in a variety of genres, but most famously found in classical music.
The riddle that I have never, ever known.
Sing us a song, you're the piano man. Sing us a song tonight. Well,
There's something different in these examples though. In these examples, the chord functions as a 5 of 5 instead of a major 2. This means it's specifically labeled as the 5 of 5 and not the major 2, and therefore not the most satisfying chord. Where the chord really shines is, in my opinion, when it functions as a major 2, or in other words, when it functions as a modal interchange. The modal interchange is a pit stop at the Lydian mode. Lydian mode is most often described as having this bright, dreamy, ethereal quality to it, perhaps because it's often used in film music in triumphant moments or as leitmotifs for the good characters. The most common example of this is the 1-2-4-1 progression, most famously used a lot by the Beatles. Notice how the 2 chord doesn't lead to the 5, but the 4 chord instead. And as you probably might have guessed, a lot of these sound like songs from the Motown label from the 60s. Here are a few popular examples. I've listened to all the top songs from Motown from the 60s, and over half of them include use of the 2 chord played in major. You could go as far as to say that major 2 is almost as common as any other chord in the Motown era because it's so commonly used. And a modern day example is seen in artists who wear their Motown inspirations very much on their sleeve.
I've heard it laced in every song, and still the words all come out. It doesn't always.
Common for all of these examples are that they are derivative, or at least inspired by rhythm, blues, jazz, and soul music from before the 60s. So basically, African American music. In other words, using the major 2 chord is common harmonic vocabulary in genres and styles derived from blues, jazz, and soul. However, I think the place where the major 2's emotional effect really comes into play is when the chord ends the phrase, which was what I showed in the examples in the beginning. Just to help you remember, here are 2 new popular examples.
It's hard for me to say, I'm jealous of the way you're happy without me.
There was also another wave in the 60s other than Motown and British Invasion who quite clearly were inspired by African American music as well. The American folk music revival. I'm mentioning this because ending a phrase on the major 2 was one of the most popular uses of the chord as opposed to the 2 other musical movements. Here's a very popular example from Robert Allen Zimmerman.
When your rooster crows at the break of dawn, look out your window and I'll be gone.
Another reason I'm mentioning this is because if we follow the timeline of folk music in the 20th century, we end up at Elliott Smith. Other videos on the use of the major 2 chord call it the Elliott Smith chord because he uses it in every song. And when I say uses it, I mean using the chord as a modal interchange, not a secondary dominant, and ending the phrase with said chord. Here are a few examples.
With the world through the eyes of a girl who's still around the morning after.
It goes without saying, but Elliott Smith has been highly influential for musicians in the 21st century. One of the artists who is clearly very inspired by Elliott Smith is Phoebe Bridgers. I think this song of hers is the best example to showcase the emotional quality the chord encompasses. This was a long explanation for a simple and pretty common chord. But if you like some of these examples, try using the 2 chord in major instead of minor in your next song. You know, try playing a D major in C major. Try G major in F major. In other words, fuck around and find out.